Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Build an Ethical AI Culture. I'm Lorianne McLaughlin, Senior Editor Digital at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating the event. Today's program is sponsored by MIT Sloan Executive Education. AI ethics is not a one-and-done policy exercise. When organizations build AI solutions, they need to embed ethics into the process from an early stage and make it a part of everyday work. There's a lot to learn from innovating companies that are leading the way here. Our speaker today is Thomas Davenport. He is a distinguished professor at Babson College, a visiting professor at the UVA Darden School of Business, a fellow of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, and a senior advisor to Deloitte's Chief Data and Analytics Officer program. He is also the co-author of the book, Working with AI, Real Stories of Human-Machine Collaboration from MIT Press. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Lori. Happy to be here with you today. And thanks to everybody who has tuned in and looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. So our topic today is AI ethics, and I have been following this for a while. I don't consider myself an ethicist, not an easy word to say, but I certainly believe that it's one of the more important issues for any organization considering doing a lot with AI. And there are various sort of aspects of AI ethics. There is the algorithmic bias issue in machine learning. You've heard examples of this, the Amazon human resource system trying to predict who would be successful at Amazon that was biased toward men because it was trained mostly on men who have been successful at Amazon in the engineering area. This has been discussed with regard to some genders and races being biased against because machine learning can pick up some facial images and make sense of them better than others. I don't know, maybe it's an advantage now if machine learning can't identify your face. We may all be wanting that at some point. Then there's the model transparency issue, and there are different aspects to that. A number of organizations now are saying that open source AI models are more transparent. However, the complexity of particularly generative AI models, they may be transparent to a data scientist, but they're not transparent to most individuals. But I think Sam Altman of OpenAI recently said, we may not be on the right side of history by not offering open source models the way that organizations like Meta and DeepSeek have. Then there is the issue of can we just make sense of what's going on? And this has been going on for a while. Credit scoring was one of the first machine learning models ever, developed originally in the 1960s and became popular starting in the late 1970s. And now, at least, organizations like FICO, used to be called Fair Isaac, will tell you exactly what are the factors that go into your credit score so you can understand them and try to improve them. However, this has become an issue related to competitive advantage for some organizations. Capital One, for a while, I'm not sure if they still do it, decided that they were going to have their own credit scoring model, and they didn't want to reveal what the variables and coefficients were because they thought it was a competitive advantage. So I think if it's commercial, that's one thing. This issue has also been addressed with regard to judicial sentencing and predictions of recidivism. And there are some models that are transparent for that and some commercial ones that aren't. And that doesn't seem to be a good area where someone being sentenced shouldn't know, what the criteria are. Then there's the issue of just revealing that you're using AI. That didn't used to be an issue, but now that AI has gotten much better at conversation, I think it's becoming more of an issue. You may recall that when Google first introduced its product, briefly called Duplex, and then it became known as Google Assistant, they made a reservation, I think, for a hair salon appointment and didn't tell the person in the demo, at least, that an AI system was talking to them. And they had added pauses and words, sounds like, into the discussion to make it seem more human. But they were widely criticized for that, and now reveal when Google Assistant is making a reservation for you. Then you may recall we used to be worried about insensitivity in language. We seem, in the United States at least, to be a little bit less worried about that now, but I'm not sure that is a good move. But there's also insensitivity relative to images, and just yesterday, Meta was criticized for showing a lot of images of murder to people who subscribe to Instagram Reels. And they apologized for it, but I think that could be lumped into the insensitivity category. Or some of the early models from OpenAI had issues with insensitivity. They have largely, I think, gotten rid of those with some of their reinforcement learning with human feedback. And that's basically how the generative AI model creators try to avoid that issue. And then there's the issue of AI-based product safety and effectiveness. And I don't know if you don't recognize this image. It is a Tesla, I don't know whether it's a Model 3 or a Model S, that has burned to a crisp. And you may think that it's an exaggeration to show a burnt Tesla, but if you look at highway death statistics, you'll see that the Tesla is the most likely to cause a highway death of any car on the road today. And I think that is partly because of the overly optimistic advertising about this idea of full self-driving or of autopilot. I have some personal experience with this. I have owned 2 Teslas in the past. I do not own one now. I will not buy one again for a host of reasons, but it was, I only had autopilot. Thank God I didn't pay for full self-driving. At the time, I think they were charging $12,000 for full self-driving capabilities. And as anyone will tell you, it's not really full self-driving. Under certain circumstances, it works well, but it doesn't recognize things that it's unfamiliar with, like any machine learning system that has been trained on images and so on. So I think that is becoming an issue. I'm not quite sure why Tesla hasn't gotten in trouble for that. I think there are some lawsuits. But anyway, these are some of the typical concerns that organizations have and individuals have with regard to AI ethics. And then there are AI-related ethical concerns. Certainly, misuse of personal data can happen in areas other than AI, but it's, I think, more of a concern maybe with AI. The whole Cambridge Analytica and Facebook story back in 2016, I think, fell into that category where people were not told that the data they were providing to Facebook was going to be used to decide what political ads should be shown to them. I guess maybe now we're more used to that. That old story of Target suggesting that a woman was pregnant and then finding out it was a teenager, and her father getting all upset. It turned out she was pregnant, but Target was producing marketing materials to people on the assumption that they were pregnant. Some people, I think, thought that was smart marketing. Some people thought it was misuse of data. Content moderation is, of course, a big issue here, and particularly in social media, particularly with regard to Facebook and Meta. There are lots and lots of content moderation issues. Now, Mark Zuckerberg has declared he's not going to be quite as worried about content moderation anymore, which, again, I think is a bit unfortunate. At one point, I think Facebook was employing or outsourcing to over 10,000 people who were doing content moderation. Increasingly, I think companies like Meta are trying to reduce the number of people doing that and turning to AI. AI is, somewhat effective at it, but not great. And I think that is certainly an ethical concern. And that was related to the issue yesterday that appeared on Instagram Reels. There's the issue of AI algorithms leading to divisiveness and, classifying people as liking one party or candidate versus another. And we get into these filter bubbles where we're only interested in seeing content that we like. So that appears to be something that is going to be very hard for these social media providers to give up, and it seems to be ingrained in our society, unfortunately. And then there's the issue of AI algorithms that are based on social preferences. So some dating sites have been criticized for only showing you dating candidates that are the same race and sexual preference that you are. And some people think, again, that is good marketing, and some people think that it is an AI ethical concern. And I think it's important to realize that at times there are commercial implications of how we set up the ethics in an AI system. And some organizations may feel like they'll take a bit of a financial or operational performance hit if they eliminate all of these ethical issues. I'm not sure there's any documented example of that happening, but I was having a discussion recently with an organization. I'll say more about them later in one of the case studies I present. It's a company called Holistic AI that started out doing ethics-based evaluations of companies' AI use cases. It's a company based in London. Interesting founders. One is a PhD computer scientist. The other is a PhD philosopher. You don't see that combination very often. And I said, you still think of yourself as an ethics platform? And they said, no, now we think of ourselves more as a broader AI governance platform, suggesting, I think, that ethics alone was not enough to drive commercial success, which I found a little bit sad. So let's get some input from you about what your concern is related to AI ethics at your organization. Do you think your algorithms might be biased? Are you making decisions on recommendations that models you don't understand? Transparency issue, the product and service safety issue. You think in general you're not really testing enough for ethics, or your company isn't serious about ethics? And I think I can't actually see it. There's an other category if you're not worried about anything, or if some other issue that concerns you. So I'll interpret these. Not too many of you. Well, bias is coming up a bit. The leader in the clubhouse is the transparency issue. Some of you seem to be concerned now. I guess that's in the lead, that your AI systems aren't sufficiently tested or validated. Not too worried about safety and effectiveness. Not too many Tesla employees in the audience. No, just kidding there. Great cars anyway, except for maybe it's how the humans use them. That's the issue. We figured out that the two primary ones are the transparency issue and the number 4, that your AI systems aren't sufficiently tested and validated for ethical concerns. So, and I think number 4 is relatively easy to address. Number 2 is, I think, challenging to address given the increased complexity of models. There are, by the way, in some highly regulated industries like banking and healthcare, restrictions on just how complex the models are or can be. There are banks, for example, who think that deep learning models would make better decisions about credit, extending credit to customers, but regulators won't let them just because the models are not understandable or interpretable by the average consumer. Okay, so I do some work with Deloitte, and they've surveyed people on this issue. I wanted to give you a sense of how ethics considerations compare to other sorts of issues. And, this looks like it shows some variation. The variation is not particularly large in terms of the AI risk that companies are worried about, but cybersecurity is the highest, both for companies that feel like they're fully prepared to address AI risk and those that think it's a major extreme concern. Ethics issues are just yet another risk that organizations consider. It's down, tied with a lot of things, but kind of in the middle. And interestingly, I've done some other surveys with Deloitte over the years where we ask people if they think that potential job loss is an ethical issue. It's the one underneath ethics issues. And a number of people, I think a majority in most of the surveys, have said that they do think that potential job loss is an ethical issue. So I don't think there's any right answer to that question, but it's interesting that many people think that it is. So the top ethical risk in this survey is the safety concern one, not the one that you mentioned, but transparency was, again, all of these are pretty tied. Lack of explainability and transparency. This is one of the surveys where they said elimination of jobs was an ethical risk, using AI to manipulate people's thinking and behavior. It's interesting. I think we don't worry so much about that if it's to manipulate people's thinking and behavior in a positive direction. I recently wrote a book co-authored a book called All In on AI. And one of the objectives that companies have is changing, customer thinking and behavior. The organizations that we profiled are ones that are doing it to improve, healthcare, for example. And nobody objects to that much, but if we're turning people against their neighbors, that's not generally considered so good. And bias is relatively low issue. I don't know if that's because there really isn't any bias or because people can't even understand the models well enough to know if they're biased or not. So it's interesting that a fairly large percentage said both that the organization is adopting AI technologies more slowly because of certain risk, not ethics risk only. And they feel that negative public perceptions might slow or stop adoption of some AI technologies. We proceed sort of headlong on new AI innovations, and I think generally assume that once they're fully available, that the public will adopt them. But on self-driving cars, for example, there is generally a pretty substantial majority that say they don't want to buy a car that is fully self-driven. Now, that may change as people become more comfortable with the idea. In general, I think we're getting more comfortable with the idea of, Waymo vehicles driving around San Francisco and Phoenix and so on, and more people are using them. But initially, there were some substantial concerns about that. So we asked in the survey also, what is your organization doing? And broke it up into 3 categories of people just starting with AI, people who are more skilled, and people who organizations that are really quite seasoned. And again, not a huge amount of variation here, but among the highest are aligning risk management with broader efforts, having a single executive be in charge, the top one, keeping a formal inventory of all of our AI implementations and use cases, which I'll talk about more in a second. Internal audit is getting involved. There hasn't been historically a lot of outside vendors for auditing AI. In part, when I talk to my friends in public accounting and audit businesses, they say that's been because there were no regulations to which organizations had to show compliance. That's starting to change with the AI Act in Europe. And so I've noticed that some of the big 4 accounting firms, for example, are starting to offer, they don't call them audits yet, but at least assessments of compliance with the AI Act. Seasoned companies are also quite worried about, I think, what's an important cultural issue, which is training practitioners on how they recognize and resolve ethical issues around AI, which we'll say more about. But again, there are a lot of things to think about here, and I think a pretty convincing set of reasons for putting someone in charge of this issue in your organization. You can't just assume that it's going to happen automatically. So this chart comes from PwC. I had a friend who was the head of AI there. He's now a professor at Carnegie Mellon, but he would come to my class and talk about all of the issues that they recognized in AI ethics. And I show this slide to really show all the different domains of AI that come into play, even some really about the broader context of the organization, like, how about your overall strategy as an organization? Does that maybe lead you to develop AI that might be unethical, or industry standards and regulations? As I mentioned, in banking, you see that those are limiting to some degree the degree of, I guess, opacity of the models, the transparency issue, your internal policies and practices, and then you get into how you plan your AI activities and your various technology-related issues for making things happen, how you deal with change management, and then you get into the yellow part is really building the models. There are a lot of potential ethics issues there. Once they're built, in many cases, we can't actually detect bias in algorithms until the model's actually built and we see what it's recommending that we do. If the model's suggesting that we only hire a certain type of person in an HR machine learning model, then we know there must be some bias built in. But again, the models are so complex that often we can't see that until we evaluate it after it's been developed. And then even ongoing operational support and compliance and so on, models can change over time. And so there are reasons to think about AI ethics there. So it's an ongoing problem, as I think Lori suggested in the introduction. So there's also the question of how often do AI ethics problems really happen? The answer is we don't really know. A friend of mine at Oxford Said Business School did a study of how many have been publicized, and there weren't terribly many. They found 100 examples of publicized AI ethics issues. I'm sure a lot of people in organizations want to keep them quiet if possible. We keep hearing about the same issues over and over. I didn't mention, for example, Microsoft Tay, the chatbot that very quickly in the US, less so in China, started using insensitive language because it was learning from the people who were using the chatbot. But A, it was an R&D project, and B, we just heard about it over and over. And I think that's true about the Amazon HR model. And of course, there's the issue of how biased are humans? And I think the answer is pretty biased. And so maybe AI in some cases can be better than humans do. I always say, if you're thinking about algorithm for predicting humans, then you for predicting what humans are going to succeed in your organization, those tend to be, I think, less biased than human decision makings about who to hire, because we say, well, that person was in my fraternity or sorority, or that person played rugby, and so do I, and so I think we need to hire them. We don't clarify that, but we're just comfortable with people who are like us. But as AI use cases, I think we're likely to see that ethical problems will also proliferate unless organizations do a good job of that. The things that companies can do about AI ethics, they can create heads of AI ethics. I've mostly found these in vendor organizations. Certainly Microsoft had one quite early. Google had an AI ethics group that didn't work out terribly well over the long run. Many of them ended up leaving or were fired, depending on who you believe. Not as many in user companies with regard to AI. You can do research on AI ethics, and Google had some of those, but two top researchers, and again, there's some debate about whether they were fired or left of their own accord. You can create new organizational structures. So Fidelity created an algorithm review board to see, is the model likely to work? You can document AI models. So some of those researchers who are no longer at Google created this idea of model cards, which is a way to document important aspects of every AI model that you put into production anyway. And I wrote about this in one of the handouts. It's about Salesforce and their use of model cards, among other AI ethics related approaches. You can do lots of beta testing. So GPT-3, for example, was in private beta for 6 months while they did reinforcement learning with human feedback and tried to eliminate some of the insensitivity of language issues. You can use external assessors to evaluate use cases, which Holistic AI is an example of. There's some other companies as well that will do that. You may think there's some other things that they could do as well, but those are the most common things. So polling question number 2 is, what do you think is the most important first step in AI ethics? Is it creating policies, putting somebody in charge, creating a process to address it, examining every use case to see if it complies with your ethical guidelines, delay introducing AI, that, as I said, OpenAI did with GPT-3, or create a technology platform that monitors every use case in somewhat automated fashion, or something else. Okay, so we're starting to see some votes here. Creating a process, I agree, is a good thing to do. Little bit on formal policies. I agree, it's not a bad first step. If that's all you do, it's probably not enough, but putting someone in charge is doing pretty well. Creating a technology platform is doing pretty well. Delaying doesn't seem to be as popular, and examining every use case doesn't seem to be as popular. Maybe you think that's impractical, but creating the technology platform is a way to examine every use case. But the winners seem to be creating an organizational process and creating a set of formal policies. And I'll talk about what some organizations are doing with some of those very things. So Unilever is one of the organizations that I studied pretty early on, wrote about them a lot in this book, All In on AI. They historically have been noted for their interest in sustainability and ethics. Some of the people at Ben and Jerry's were not that happy with their Unilever owners. Now they're going to spin out Ben and Jerry's so that they can feel free to be more political, I guess. But early on, Unilever realized that this was an important issue. They created what they call an AI assurance function. And it was not just looking at ethics, but also looking at, does the model do what it's supposed to do? Is it effective or not? But it certainly established standards for ethics, compliance, and performance. And they were the first customer I knew of holistic AI to do assurance reviews. And basically what happens is the person proposing the use case at a very early stage fills out a number of questionnaire answers, and holistic AI tells them, well, it looks like it might be okay, or you're going to have problems with this issue. You might want to revise this as you design and build the use case. And then they build it, and there is a later review of, is it doing what it was supposed to do? They've reviewed several hundred use cases by now, and only a handful needed to change. And the process is semi-automated. As I say, you still have to answer a number of questions, but the feeling is that most of this is done on the basis of not an individual looking at it, but a computer program looking at it, a platform, if you will. Scotiabank, both Unilever and Scotiabank case studies are in the handouts if you'd like to see them. And thanks to Sloan Management Review for making both of those available. But Scotiabank wrote about more recently with Randy Bean. They this is a Canadian bank, of course. They have an AI risk management policy in place. Also very focused on data ethics, and they have a data ethics team. It's part of the code of conduct to which all employees have to sign off. Yes, I am, following these principles of conduct relative to data. There's mandatory data ethics education for everybody involved with, remotely with data or AI. Which I think is a good thing. Obviously, those people are putting responsible for putting a lot of these systems into practice and production. They worked with Deloitte to create a automated review of use cases before it's deployed, kind of like the holistic AI system that I mentioned. And they, I think, get everybody engaged in this process. For example, they built a customer service chatbot, and they got the customer service employees involved in managing the unstructured data to figure out what was the most effective answer to customer questions and so on. And I think that kind of, democratization of the process is important, not only to your ethics, but also to your productivity as an organization in getting these systems up and running. So I would argue there are really sort of 5 stages of AI ethics, and it sort of starts with talk and moves to action. So the first stage, people evangelize about, this is important, and you speak internally and externally about it. Then you develop a set of formal policies. I think documentation is important, where you record ethics-oriented data, the model card sort of idea. Some systematic review, I think, is necessary to determine if it meets the company's standards. And of course, that review is not very valuable without some action to say, we have to modify this one or eliminate it altogether. It's interesting. We have some regulation there. related to ethics. There is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a New York City, I think it's just city and not state, regulation about AI as it relates to hiring people. And it specifies, lots of penalties if you violate the standards and so on. But it turns out they were not actually enforcing that particular regulation. So clearly of limited value as an influence on behavior if you don't enforce it. So I think overall we sort of need a process for how we scale ethical AI up. There are, a lot of ways that we scale AI in general. We have governance in place, we have funding mechanisms, we build platforms, we hire talent, a lot of companies have put in place these sort of AI factories to produce AI much more rapidly. But at the same time, we have to make sure that AI is embedded into, all the key steps that we do. What's our strategy going to be? What use cases might make sense for us? We develop a model, we deploy the model, we monitor the model, and ethics come into place throughout that entire process. So I think, obviously, I'm preaching a little bit to the converted here. Many of you said, sure, policies are important, but developing a process is even more important. And that's what Unilever did. That's what Scotiabank did. And I think that's what the most successful organizations do with regard to AI ethics. So with that, I will stop yammering, and it might be time to do some Q&A.
Thanks so much for your insights in that presentation. So, Tom, let's dive into some questions. So, the first question is, a lot of AI ethics comes down to behavior, everyday behavior, how people are acting on AI ethics. Do you think, Tom, that organizations will move toward monitoring employee behavior relative to AI to ensure ethical use of AI?
Well, it's interesting. I once had an AI image generator create an image of a policeman looking at how a doctor was using AI. Because I think, with generative AI, we see this a lot. It hallucinates. We'd like for people to check whether the hallucinations are making their way into the final output. I tell my students all the time, you need to review the output. Yet, I think in one early MIT faculty study, 68% didn't review the output of generative AI at all. There was a recent study from Microsoft suggesting that our critical thinking is declining because of generative AI. So I think, yes, Lori, for not just for reasons of ethics, but for reasons of accuracy and quality of output and so on, as long as generative AI hallucinates and writes boring stuff and so on. I mean, it's the same way if you were writing an article for MIT Sloan Management Review, you'd want to have every author make sure that, maybe some research could be done with generative AI, but you don't want the whole thing to be written. So you have to kind of monitor and police these things a bit.
It really does open up some interesting questions of trust because, of course, high-performing employees don't like being monitored. They want to feel they're being trusted, yet the employers need to have some reassurance that people are using the tools appropriately. So I feel like this is going to be an evolving people management problem for leaders who are dealing with generative AI.
Absolutely. And, the people using generative AI are typically knowledge workers. And I wrote a book a number of years ago. Not too many people bought it. It's called Thinking for a Living, about how to improve the performance of knowledge workers. And one of the things I concluded from that research is knowledge workers don't really like to be told what to do. Maybe nobody does, but particularly knowledge workers didn't get all that education to be manage. Some people are complaining that that's what's happening with this government effort to have people tell 5 things they've done in the past week. Knowledge workers don't really like that very much.
Good point about knowledge workers. Very salient. So, we talked a little bit about Scotiabank. Interesting example, putting AI ethics into practice. They formed this data ethics team, which was very successful. Tom, how common is that right now for companies to form a data ethics team? And what would be your suggestion for people in the audience who feel like, wow, my organization could really use a data ethics team? I'd like to advocate for one.
Well, Lori, I think it's more common in Canada, and when they become the 51st state, it'll spread to the United States. No, just kidding. I think that's actually a pretty bad and unlikely idea. I don't think it's nearly as common as it should be. You see it a fair amount in vendors. You see it in highly regulated industries. Banking, of course, is more likely. They can get into big trouble if they don't have good data ethics. Healthcare, you violate HIPAA policies, you get into big trouble. But elsewhere, I don't see it much at all. And I think it needs to move to less regulated industries. Anybody can get in trouble for this and get a lot of bad publicity for it and lose the trust of your customers. And it's really not easy. I'm just working on a new book now about customer use of AI, and customers are very schizophrenic. On the one hand, they say companies have way too much information about them, but on the other hand, they want personalized offers and ads and so on. It's hard to do one without the other. So it needs a lot of clear thinking, I think, by management and the people doing the work.
And the leaders who are interested in building these teams will, of course, need to gather talent around them to get this work done. Do you have any advice for people on, who to gather around for these ethics teams? How to identify ethics talent? This is a new area.
Well, let's speak on behalf of the many liberal arts majors out there who have a tough time finding jobs these days. And always have, really. I think companies think, AI talent has to be highly technical. But, as I mentioned, some combination of technical people and, philosophically minded people who care about humans and customers and so on, makes a really good match. And obviously, I think the liberal arts graduates need to understand something about how AI works to be useful on these projects and so on. But those who are willing to learn, I think, make great candidates for being on ethics teams.
So think outside of the typical IT hiring box.
Exactly. And, much of the IT work is increasingly being done. We did a webinar on that with you on kind of citizen development and citizen automation. And so increasingly, I think awareness of how to use IT, but some sense of, what's happening in the broader world are going to be really important traits.
Problem solvers. They come from everywhere.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. We have a lot of questions from the audience today around what is ethics? Do leaders or employees really understand it? Richard asks, my number one concern is that many people don't understand ethics or the need for it. Is there research that tests the degree to which people understand what ethics is and why it's necessary?
Well, I think they're, as I say, I don't consider myself an AI ethicist, but I'm a sociologist by training, not, I don't have any formal training in ethics, but I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of ambiguity around the term ethics. There is a need for discussion about it. Basically, in AI, we often use the term alignment. Is this system aligned with human values? There's a lot of ambiguity about that as well. And you have some companies like, Anthropic says we're more oriented to alignment than some of our competitors. I don't necessarily see that day to day. I think they probably have some employees who are oriented to it. I was trying to encourage my son to apply for a job there, and I noticed that in some of their job application information, they do want to hear something about your orientation to those issues. But no, it's always going to be an issue that's discussed. We've been discussing ethics and what it means since Aristotle, and I don't think we're going to stop now. But having people discuss and decide what's good for us, our employees, our customers, and how do we sort of deal with trade-offs in that regard is good enough for the moment.
Lot of education to be done on both sides, both the leaders and the teams on ethics. You mentioned Aristotle. For any of our viewers who are interested in the philosophy angle on this topic, we had a recent article by one of our editors, David Kieran, called "Philosophy Eats AI" in MIT Sloan Management Review. It's worth checking out for a look at how philosophy shapes the innards of the AI programs and also AI strategies. But let's take a different turn now. We have some questions from the audience around smaller organizations and how they can deal with AI ethics. Carol asks, a lot of the requirements can be very expensive and maybe out of reach to smaller organizations. What is the priority for the start of AI ethics in smaller organizations? How can you get going if you don't have access to a big investment?
Good question. Yeah, and I don't think most small organizations probably aren't going to need an automated platform for examining their use cases. If you're a small organization, you're typically going to have a relatively small number of AI, projects and applications, and so shouldn't be too hard to at least have a quick discussion about is this consistent with our ethics as an organization? Are there issues that might get us into trouble if somebody, in the public or the press found out about them? Are we violating our customers' trust? You don't have to have, I think, a huge organization or even somebody who is only concerned with AI ethics issues. If you're a small to medium-sized organization, you can get the people together in a room and discuss it easily enough.
So the task is more about getting everyone on your small team engaged with the topic versus, blocking out the formalities.
Right. I think, the primary issue is caring about ethics and having, systematic discussion about it and doing something about it if you find out that something is amiss.
Right. Well, if people aren't passionate about the topic and engaged with the topic, the formalities will not be followed for sure. All right. We have a lot of questions around governance and regulations today. Tom, I know you've been interested in the Paris AI Action Summit. Tell us about that in terms of the implications for the spread of ethical AI.
Well, Lori, unfortunately, I think it should have been called the Paris AI in Action Summit because there was, in contrast to some of the previous summits, which focused on AI safety and alignment with human values and so on, this one was more oriented to saying, let's get on with it and we'll figure out any problems later. And J.D. Vance, our new vice president, spoke to them and said, I'm not really interested in AI safety. I'm interested in, progress and getting there first. So unfortunately, I think the global climate, even in Europe, where they have paid a lot more attention to AI ethics, there's a feeling that sort of their regulation focus has kind of driven out innovation. I'm not sure at all that there really is a contradiction between those two things. And I think I really applaud the European governments for creating the AI Act and so on. And the good news, I think, is that a number of companies will feel, if they want to do business in Europe, they're going to have to comply with it. And there are, awful lot of customers in Europe. But even Macron from France said, we're backing off a little bit. Maybe we were too strict in the past. So I think, and there was a document that came out at the end, expressing that we needed to be inclusive and involve multiple stakeholders and be oriented to humans in developing ethics. And the US and the UK didn't even want to sign that. So not a good sign in general for regulation and ethics and safety.
So that leads into another question from a reader, which is, do you see the regulation approaches converging at all between the EU and the US? The EU has been somewhat stricter on ethical AI, whereas the US seems to be focused more on governance. Do you see the two sets of regulations coming closer together or not?
Not, sadly. I think the prospects for significant regulation in the US at the federal level are pretty much nil over the next 4 years. And there are states, of course, that have developed some regulations. I'm in California right now, and there is some California data privacy regulation. There was some AI regulation proposed, and the governor didn't think it was satisfactory, so he vetoed it. I think there will be another attempt, but it's really a kind of nutty idea to have state by state, or even worse, city by city AI regulation. We need something at the federal level. Ideally, we'd have something at the United Nations level that, if you don't obey AI ethics, you're going to get in trouble. And, I think this is, you say right now, it's not that big of an issue, but people from companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google were at the Paris AI in Action Summit, and they said, we think we'll have artificial general intelligence in 3 to 5 years now. Well, wow, we're not ready for that. We don't even have a clue how to deal with the AI capabilities that we have today. And if we have machines that are smarter than us in every way, we're in big trouble unless we move more rapidly on the ethical and regulatory front.
Okay.
On that sobering note.
sobering take on the future of regulation. Another viewer has a question. This is an interesting question, which is, as a leader, how do you monitor the AI ethics of other systems that you're purchasing? For example, you're purchasing an HR software system that is using AI. How do you know as a buyer whether this aligns with your company's AI ethics principles?
Great question. And more people are, buying these capabilities. So Unilever, for example, works a lot with external advertising agencies and so on. And they decided that every AI application that they used that came from an outside provider needed to meet the same ethical standards that they were using internally. So they ran it through their holistic AI assessment and so on. And I think it's a very important thing to do. They and many other companies had been using a system, for example, called HireVue, which had decided that you could somehow decide what the leadership qualities of a person are by looking at their face on a video, which was really a nutty idea. Now, that wasn't the only thing that they did. They had some, it was a way to really increase the productivity of hiring processes, and Unilever was trying it out, and they realized this is not true. You can't determine leadership qualities by looking at a face, and B, not fair to applicants, so they discontinued it. So you really do have to be careful about that set of issues.
So they were actually running every tool through this evaluation.
Once they put the AI insurance process in place, they thought that was very important.
That's a very thorough approach and an interesting one for others to consider. Um, Tom, are there other specific lessons from Scotiabank or from Unilever that people here today who are perhaps earlier on their journey with AI ethics that you would suggest they focus on and take away?
Well, I guess one thing that I didn't really emphasize enough probably is just getting people together to start thinking about the issue. So at Unilever and Scotiabank, the chief data and analytics officers were very serious about this, and they convened groups to start addressing it and to start thinking about policies and so on. It didn't come from the top of the organization initially. It was the people who did this on a day-to-day basis to say, we need an approach to AI ethics that ensures it, fits with our ethical standards as a corporation. And, maybe at some point you'll get pressure from the CEO or whatever to do something about this. But I think even if you're not having that, it's better to start to create policies and processes with the people who do AI work on a daily basis.
That's a really important point, because that is not a top down. That's, from the people on the front lines who are actually out there running into the ethics dilemmas, helping teach other people how to deal with those ethics dilemmas. So that's certainly a model others can learn from. Okay, well, I see we're at time. Tom, I want to thank you for sharing your insights today. This has been a great discussion. I want to thank everyone in the audience. We had a lot of engagement and a lot of great questions. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, MIT Sloan Executive Education. Have a great day, everyone.